Ink Beneath the City. Chapter 1. The River That Doesn't Forget. The rain came like an argument the sky had been saving for years. It swept across District 4 inches steel-gray sheets, hammering corrugated roofs and the slick backs of motorbikes, blurring lantern colors until the whole street looked like a painting being rinsed under a faucet. I stood in the doorway of the shop at 109 Trundine Shoe, my shop, my inheritance, my mistake watching the storm shear the city into strips. Inside, the air smelled of paper, vellum, pulp, dust, a faint thread of mildew from a damaged crate I still hadn't catalogued. The sign outside read asterisk, asterisk, palimpsest, asterisk, asterisk, in flaking gold. It was never the name my father chose, but the name I took 3 months after his heart failed without warning, and he left me with a city that remembered too much and a bookshop that remembered more. Merchants pulled vinyl over their displays. A boy in a transparent raincoat herded ducks from a flooded alley like a clumsy god. Across the street, a woman in silver slippers held an umbrella as if it were an apology. The river, brown, wide, patient, licked the quay steps like a dog at a door it knew would open. The river doesn't forget, my father used to say. It only pretends to be polite. Behind me, stacks, ladders, a walnut counter my father had carved with a pocket knife on quiet afternoons. Beneath the counter, the safe, the ledgers, an envelope with rent overdue by 2 weeks. I should have been making calls. Instead, I waited for a customer I couldn't name. It's a ritual with grief. You invent arrivals to distract from departures. The bell over the door clinked, thin as a coin. A man stepped through the rain's teeth and folded his umbrella with the care of someone putting away a weapon he once loved. He was tall in that way, that makes a room shorter, with a dark coat that shook rain onto the mat. The face was wrong. Not ugly, not quite beautiful. Wrong like a word you swear is spelled correctly until someone shows you otherwise. There were old scars on his right hand, a pale geometry across the knuckles. He smelled faintly of tobacco, not the smoke itself, but the paper it promised. "Good afternoon," he said, in a voice textured like a velvet theater curtain. "If there is such a thing today, it's as good as it gets," I said. "Welcome to palimpsest." And his gaze moved over the shelves, the ladders, the wobbly potted monstera that insisted on surviving. He didn't look like a man who bought books, more like one who commissioned silences. "I'm looking," he said, "for a ledger that doesn't want to be found." "So, if you mean a book that was misshelved, we can start with B for bad ideas." That earned me the shadow of a smile. He stepped closer to the counter, took off his coat, and shook it once, rain spattering the floor with a pattern like music in a language I had never learned. Underneath, he wore a black shirt buttoned high, a silver tie pin in the shape of a knot that made my fingers itch with the desire to untangle something. "Do you buy?" he asked. "Things people shouldn't have written down?" "I sell things people shouldn't have read," I said. "But buying? Depends." He set a waterproof satchel on the counter and unfolded the top flap. Inside was another envelope, thick and gray. He slid it toward me with a fingertip. The envelope had no stamp. My name was written across it in ink that had bled when it dried, as if the letters had tried to escape. I stared. He nodded. "It's for you. It's from someone you once watched from across a room. Someone who watched you, too. Who are you?" "A courier," he said, "which is what men call themselves when they carry more than mail." I broke the seal. The paper inside felt old, though it wasn't, textured like skin after salt water. The letter wasn't long, Asterisk Elena, asterisk, asterisk. We haven't met, but we are already hunting the same thing. Tonight at midnight, the ferryman will brew jujube tea behind the terminal on the wharf and pretend not to know me. You'll pretend not to know me, too. Bring the ledger your father kept in the years he said he didn't keep one. Bring the ring you never wear. Bring what you don't admit you still have. The letter I wrote long ago and never sent. Asterisk, asterisk, come alone. If you don't, bring your truest lie with you. That will do. Asterisk, asterisk. You won't recognize me, but you will. Asterisk, asterisk, L, asterisk. The ink had dried with a sheen I forced myself not to notice. I turned the sheet over. Nothing. The city hummed inside my chest like a wet power line. Who gave you this? I asked. An old man with a young man's posture, the courier said. At a hotel where the orchids are real, which means they feel false. How much did he pay you? He tilted his head. Enough to get wet for you. For me? Everyone likes to believe it's for them. There's a trick I learned from my father and from the little gods of the market. Bargain with the truth instead of lying. I don't have my father's ledger, I said. He never kept one. So, you've told the inspector, the courier replied, and the men who came with him and the men who came after they left. What men? He smiled again. Wrongly. Men who like lists. Men who think a city is a ledger if you press hard enough. It is say and say for. I'm not meeting anyone at midnight, I said. I don't drink tea. You don't need to drink it. That's why it's tea. He picked up his umbrella and turned toward the door, then paused and glanced over his shoulder in the slow, deliberate way of someone who has learned that any sudden movement makes other people reach for guns they swear they don't own. You should come, Elena. You won't be able to stop yourself. Why? Because you kept the ring, he said, and because you kept the unsent letter. You would be surprised how few people keep the things they never received. The bell clinked again. Rain swallowed him whole. I stood very still. My heart had the precise mechanical feel of the pendulum clock behind the counter, swings measured in the economics of seconds. Where did he learn my name? Whoever L was, he had traced his finger along the spine of my life and blown the dust from it. The ring was in the safe beneath the counter, in a velvet box the color of a bruise. I took it out and set it next to the new letter. It wasn't a wedding ring. Its circumference said promise, while the metal said debt. A thin band of white gold with a knot motif, not unlike the man's tie pin. My father had bought it from my mother before she left. He never gave it to her. He gave it to me at 14 when the person I loved most moved away without warning, and he said, asterisk, keep this for someone you'll keep better than I kept her, asterisk. I wore it for exactly 3 days at 20, then hid it where I hide things I'm afraid will outlast me. The unsent letter was harder to justify keeping. It was written by a boy named Koa, who taught me that the difference between leaving and escaping is whether you take your ghosts with you. He had given me so many things. A blue lighter I still used, though I didn't smoke, the taste of salt on an abandoned pier, the word times, stay times said like a secret. We were 18, then 19, then not together. He died at sea 8 years ago. The letter was found in a box under his mother's bed after the funeral, addressed to me, never posted. She gave it to me with hands that shook like a tethered animal. I never opened it. Some things you keep unopened, because nothing inside can damage you as badly as the possibility. Interesting. I had never told anyone about the letter, not even my father. Yet the courier had named it. The knot tightened in my chest in mirror to the ring. The city opened her mouth and drank. "I'm not going," I told the clock. The clock kept swinging. The river licked the quay. The shop hummed. The unsent letter said nothing. The ring said less. Around dusk, the power went and came back with a shrug. The storm revised itself into a steadier narrative. A girl in a wet hoodie bought a battered copy of Times Anna Karenina, Times because the train parts made her feel less alone. A tourist asked for something by that Murakami, no, the other one, and left with a free map and a promise to return. I told myself I would close early, but early in my vocabulary is datable to a time before my father died. After 9, I locked up and counted the register and did not watch the clock watch me. At 11:30, I put on a raincoat and told no one I would be back. I left the safe empty. I took the ring. I took the unsent letter. I took a knife, because I am smaller than I look and the city does not honor metaphors after midnight. The streets between District 4 and the wharf were thoughts I had only half finished, crowded, incandescent, obnoxiously alive. The storm had worn itself thin and now lay on the city like damp silk. Somewhere above the low cloud, the sky was thinking about stars. But the neon didn't want them. Men with plastic stools arranged themselves in wet constellations around bowls of soup, smoke spiraling up like unanswered prayers. I passed a sleeping dog that kept one eye open out of professional caution. On a billboard, a bank promised security in a font that looked like forgiveness. The wharf had a particular smell at night. Metal tired of itself, old wood, river breath, fish refusing metaphor. The last ferry had carried away families, lovers, and 2 men who laughed too loudly at nothing. In the shadow of the terminal, a corrugated shack, a tea stall during day and after midnight, the seat of something older and more flexible than law. The ferryman brewed jujube tea in a dented pot. He pretended not to know the man waiting on a crate 2 meters away. He pretended not to know me. He managed both pretenses well. The man waiting was not the courier. He was younger, but time had chewed him methodically. His hair was cut close. A thin line of a scar bisected his left eyebrow. He wore a white shirt that made a promise to stay clean and failed. He held a cigarette he did not light and looked at me as if I were late to a conversation he had been having for years. "Good evening," he said. "Elena." It was a neutral voice. It could have been from Saigon, Hanoi, Zurich, a plane between them. It was the voice of a man who learned to leave quickly, and, when that failed, to leave completely. "I'm here," I said, as if that were a fact that needed stating. "So you are," he replied. "And you brought the ring." I didn't ask how he knew. Instead, I said, "And you brought the arrogance." He laughed, genuinely. "It's not arrogance. It's arithmetic. When you write to someone who keeps what isn't addressed to her, you account for the mathematics of longing." "I didn't write to you," I said. "Who are you?" He placed the unlit cigarette gently on the crate. "I'm what you get when you ask the wrong question for years and finally open your mouth at the right moment." He held out a hand. "Lucien." I took it. His palm was warm. There was a roughness to it that contradicted the neatness of his shirt. I had the feeling he could break a man's jaw and then organize his books by color. "You wrote me a letter," I said. "I wrote many letters," he said. "Most of them were to people who didn't exist when I began." The ferryman poured tea into a chipped cup, set it on the counter, and inspected it with the attention of a surgeon pretending to be a poet. He did not look at me or at Lucien. His indifference was a service he offered, like sugar and a place to sit. We took the 2 stools nearest the wall. "I didn't bring my father's ledger," I said. Lucien nodded. "You wouldn't have. He hid it too well to be retrieved by honesty. He never kept one." "Then we agree." "He didn't," Lucien said softly, "but the city did. Your father only bound it." I felt the first hairline crack in reality open like a smile. "What do you want from me?" "Id shade, to help you find what you already found," he said, "and then to keep you safe long enough to regret it." "Not a great pitch," I said. "I'm bad at sales," he said. "I prefer receipts." Rain worried at the corrugated roof. The tea steamed. I waited for him to continue. He looked out at the river with the intimacy of someone who has sworn to an element. The ferryman scraped his spoon against the pot with a sound like a memory trying to become a plan. "When I was 20, Lucien said, "I made a list of everything I owned and everything that owned me. The second list was longer. I believe your father attempted the same." "I have. My father wore slippers with holes in them and forgot to charge his phone," I said. "He didn't attempt lists. He attempted moods. And yet," Lucien said, "he made one list at least, and he put it where he always put things he didn't trust himself with." "Where?" I asked despite myself. "The place he loved least," Lucien said. "We always hide treasure where we hate. It ensures we don't visit it." I thought of my father's least loved places. He disliked hospitals with a primitive resistance. He despised banks with an educated disdain. He hated, oddly, the theater too much light on pretending, he said. But there was one place he would not speak about, because the word itself was a taste he couldn't wash from his mouth. "The flood-controlled tunnels," I said. Lucien watched my face like a scholar watching a tide table. "Yes? You're joking." "Flood waters prefer jokes," he said. "We'll show respect by bringing a serious flashlight." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded square of tracing paper. On it, faint lines underscored darker ones, the way a ghost sometimes insists on bones. He spread it on the crate. It was a map of the tunnels beneath my city, a copper tangle, an organ chart, a red pencil X marked a point not far from the shop, or far as the crow flies over roofs that rats navigated. "This is a crime," I said, not because I cared about the law, but because I needed to name the gravity. "It is an archive," he said, "which is another word for a gentle crime." "Why me?" He met my eyes with a steadiness I resented. "Because grief is a key, Elena, and you carry it in your mouth. Because your father trusted you with the one thing he didn't trust himself with. Because you kept a letter no one gave you, which means you understand the ethics of unread secrets." The ferryman set down 2 cups, one for each of us. The tea was dusky and sweet, the sort that tastes like a childhood you didn't have but someone did. We drank in silence. The river leaned against the pilings and pretended not to be listening. "What's in the ledger?" I asked. "Names," Lucien said, "of people who tried to buy the river and were instead rented by it, of shipments that should have drowned, of arrangements made when the lights fell and someone needed a precise forgetfulness." "That sounds like power," I said. "It sounds like proof," he said. "And proof is what men who think they already own the world fear most." "And you?" "He asked no tame. I own nothing," he said simply. And the lie was so elegant it could have been truth dressed for dinner. "What do you get if I help you? Money? Leverage? Me?" He held my gaze without the lazy arrogance of a man trained to win stares. "I get to keep a promise," he said, "and I get to keep you alive." "Whose promise?" His mouth tilted at one corner. "A boy who died at sea." The floor beneath me slid. The ferryman pretended not to hear the sound my heart made when it hit the wall of my chest. The cigarette on the crate waited for a fire that wouldn't come. "Koa," I said, even though the name felt like a blade. Lucien nodded once. "He wrote to you. I am the letter he couldn't send." Hey, Saigon nodded. I stood up too fast, and the world responded by moving, which it does when your past shakes it. The ferryman caught the cup before it fell. Lucien didn't reach for me. The restraint was a kind of touch. "You knew him?" I asked. "We belonged, briefly, to the same omission," he said. "We both worked for a man who enumerated the city. Koa delivered," I explained. "Your father recorded. When Koa saw what the sea does to men who break time into weapons, he tried to walk away. The sea doesn't love cowards or heroes. It loves debt. He paid." "You're saying my father recorded crimes," I said. "You're saying he worked for what? A syndicate?" "Oh my Nate, I'm saying your father did what he always did," Lucien replied. "He kept a story while telling a different one. You think that isn't the definition of a father? What do you want me to do?" My voice had found a lower register, the one it uses when it thinks the truth can be negotiated. "Follow me," he said. "At dawn, bring the things I ask for. The ring to bind a door that insists on opening, the letter to pay a ferryman who doesn't accept money. We will cross where the city keeps its reasons." "I can't," I said, though the decision had already named itself and slipped into my coat pocket. "I have a shop. You have a ledger beneath the city with your father's handwriting inside," he said. "And if we don't get to it first, the men who count storms as revenue will. If that ledger breathes daylight, they will pull tongues out of mouths to teach silence. If we drown it, they will still look for it. But for a while they will do it in the dark. We need the dark on our side, Elena. That is where I live." The ferryman cleared his throat. "If you're going to pay me with a letter composed by the dead," he said in a tone that had smoked 3 lifetimes, "write it on paper that has learned to float." Lucien rose, pressed 2 fingers gently to the tracing paper map, and folded it twice. He didn't pocket it. He placed it on the crate and weighed it with the unlit cigarette, as if knowledge should always be held down by something that wants to burn. "We'll need help," I said, surprising myself. "We'll need no witnesses," he countered. "You'll need me," the ferryman added, amusement thinning his mouth. "And my boat, and my capacity to forget what it would kill me to remember." Lucien raised the cup to him. "At 4, he said. "Behind the second pier." The ferryman shrugged. "At 4, the river bargains. At 5, it steals. Come at 4. I didn't say yes, but I stayed until the kettle sighed and the tea stalled and the night did that trick of becoming 2 hours later without proof it had passed through the intervening minutes. When I left, rain had coiled itself into a mist. Lucien walked beside me along the quay without touching me. Our shoulders were close enough to learn from each other. At the mouth of the alley where we would part, he stopped and looked down at my hand. The ring was there, cool against my knuckle. He reached out, and for a second I thought he would slide it off, and that I would let him. Instead, he turned my palm up and placed a small object in the center, a brass key, old as unlearned lessons. "The first door," he said. "To what?" "To your father's last lie." I went home to the apartment above the shop and didn't sleep. I sat on the floor of the stockroom and surrounded myself with atlases whose countries have been renamed, and I waited for the hours to weigh themselves into 4. I thought about the ring's knot and the man's tie pin, and what it means to bind something to the very thing it will use to undo itself. I thought of Koa on the night he kissed me on the pier and told me a secret I have still not figured out, and how secrets age into myths if you store them poorly. The clock on the wall glowed baleful. When it finally consented to be 3:38, I stood. I put on boots that could be forgiven for mud. I packed a flashlight and batteries and a coil of thin rope and the knife. I slipped the unsent letter into a plastic sleeve. I took the brass key from the table and threaded it onto a chain. I forgot to lock the safe because there was nothing in it left to steal. In the street, the city was on the cusp of morning, and there is no more fragile time in the day's grammar. A monk padded past with a bowl that waited for hunger to enter it. Someone hosed blood from the concrete in front of a fish stall, knowledge sluicing pink, which is how the city cleans its memory without erasing it. The sky was a rumor that had lost interest in its own ending. At the edge of the wharf, the ferryman waited, hands pockets thick, boat rocking a patient syllable. Lucien stood with his back to me, head tilted, listening to a sound I couldn't hear because I lacked the language for it. He turned when my feet clicked wood. His face arranged itself into a smile that was not for me but didn't exclude me. "You came," he said. "I'm not sure I did," I replied. "Good," he said. "We'll need the version of you who can be in two places at once." We descended into the boat. The river leaned in. My city, which has learned to lie to itself lovingly, pretended nothing unusual was happening as the ferryman pushed us off into a current that remembered all the names we thought we had invented. The surface was a bruise made of mirrors. The engine coughed and complied. "Which door first?" the ferryman asked. "The door that hates being a door," Lucien said. "Ah," said the ferryman, "the honest one." I felt for the letter inside my jacket, the ring on my finger, the key against my throat. I looked at Lucien, whose profile contained 3 histories and an omission. He looked at the tunnel's mouth, which yawned black as a pupil dilating to admit an answer. "The river doesn't forget," my father had said. "It only pretends to be polite." "Tell me," I said, because I am always making the mistake of asking for the story when I should be listening for the code. "Tell me why me?" Lucien's hand rested on the gunwale. Fingers long, knuckles mapped with invisible versions of my own history. He didn't look at me. He looked where we were going, which is one of the things I didn't know I needed until someone else did it in front of me. "Because," he said, "the city chose you. It only pretended to be polite about it." We passed under the first arch. The light narrowed to a tightness that selects. In the throat of the tunnel, water sounded like paper being turned, page after page. The boat's wake scribbled behind us, then smoothed, then forgot. The ferryman whistled a tune without notes. Lucien uncoiled the rope. I held the flashlight and wrote a white circle onto concrete walls tattooed with old tides. Somewhere behind us, the city ate the last of the night and began to bake a morning for someone else. Somewhere ahead, my father's last lie waited to become the first truth I chose without his help. Somewhere inside me, a knot practiced undoing itself into a shape the ring could approve. And somewhere, in the letter I had not opened and still had no right to, Koa had already written the words that would change my name for myself if only I would read them. The first door surprised me by being a gate. The brass key surprised me by being correct. The darkness surprised me by not being empty. "Don't look down," Lucien said, and because I wanted to be contrary, I looked. The water below was a surface and an answer. My reflection was a woman who had taken off her life like a coat and put on an adventure like a mistake. I didn't recognize her, but I might have loved her even then. "Here," the ferryman said softly. The gate's lock was old and temperamental. My hands were wet. Whether with river or rain, I couldn't tell. The key slid into the mouth of the thing that barred us and considered whether to become history. I thought of my father's hands, ink-stained, cutting the core out of an apple. I thought of Lucien's mouth making my name behave. I thought of Cora's letter, and I broke the lock with the ease of a decision that has already been made for you by a city that likes to be polite and rarely is. The gate swung. Air moved past us like a hushed crowd. The tunnel opened into a chamber, and the chamber opened into a different version of the story, and I stepped forward because I'd already been stepping forward the entire time without acknowledging it. Behind us, the river smiled, toothless and ancient. Before us, the ledger waited, and in that small, perfect pause between the two, I realized that the worst had already happened. I trusted a stranger whose lies were better than the truths I had been telling myself. Chapter 2. Doors that refuse to be only doors. The chamber breathed the way books breathe when no one is looking. The walls were poured concrete veined with old limescale, but under the flashlight beam they showed a palimpsest of markings, hash marks, depths, dates, initials that had stood up to water for years and still insisted. Pipes ran like ribs overhead, periodically grumbling with a municipal heartbeat. Somewhere a valve sighed in the language of old brass. The ferryman tied us to a cleat sticking out of the wall like a remembered sin. Lucien swung onto the platform first and offered me a hand. I ignored it and jumped. My boots landed on concrete that flexed just enough to remind me that all foundations are negotiations. "Left," he said, pointing to a corridor tiled with glazed rectangles, the color of a bruise after a week, then down. The city copied its nerves from the river copied its nerves from the men who thought they owned it. Everything repeats, Elena, even mistakes. "You make romance sound like hydraulics," I said. "It is hydraulics," the ferryman muttered. "Try loving a river. It's all pressure and release, with pockets of flood." He flicked a glance toward the small bundle I'd strapped across my chest. "You brought the letter." "Yes." "Good," he said. "There are tolls here that cannot be paid with currency that is still alive." We walked. The air cooled by degrees until the warm spoon of the night outside became a proper underground. My flashlight discovered slick patches like the breath marks of animals that had moved through recently. Lucien went ahead with the rope, letting it unreel so casually that I realized he had counted his way through these tunnels before, whether with memory or with punishment. At the first bend, I saw a thing I did not want to see. A series of heroin orange life jackets hung on hooks, their nylon stiff and sallow in the beam, each tagged with a black number. Below them, a plastic crate of plastic bracelets, the disposable kind they use at nightclubs and on hospital wards, the kind that turns a wrist into an inventory field. "Storm caches," Lucien said, as if storm caches always came with a side of moral judgment. "For who?" "For the men who catalog risk," he replied. "And for the people they decide to save, it's a different list." "You're saying my father put people on lists?" "I'm saying he understood the city's appetite and took notes while it ate," Lucien said. "Not all lists are condemnations. Some are prayers with commas." We descended a flight of steps so narrow I had to angle my shoulders. The tiles were chipped, exposing the rough, honest brick behind. At the bottom, an arch squatted, low and patient, its keystone painted with numbers that didn't look like numbers. It took me a second to realize what they were. Dates written backwards, from present to past, counting down like a heartbeat's monitor when the line goes from mountain range to horizon. "Which one is ours?" I asked. "Your father's dates stop at the day you left for university," Lucien said, crouching to run his fingertips across the chalk smear beneath the paint. "He was superstitious like that." "He was not superstitious," I snapped, then closed my mouth over the useless loyalty. "He carried a rabbit's foot I found in the market and tied red thread around everything that stayed where it was supposed to. He believed in economy," Lucien said gently. "Every superstition is a budget. Pay now in gestures to avoid costs later in grief." When he slid the brass key into a smaller lock set into the arch's side, the sound it made was not mechanical. It was intimate, like a throat clearing right before a person tells the truth. The arch shifted, the floor tilted up a degree, and then back down as some old cantilever accepted its role in our trespass. The gate pulled inward 1/2 meter. The smell that came out was not pleasant, not even interesting, only honest river, rot, paper that has been too damp for too long and still insists on being paper inside. A corridor that was not a corridor, but a narrow chamber with walls that didn't want to be walls. Wooden shelving, old untreated boards resting on bricks ran along both sides, but the shelves were sparsely occupied. In one place, a line of glass jars full of dull copper coins. In another, a crate of cassette tapes, labeled in a script I recognized and hated to recognize. My father's, not the readable, open bookshop hand, but the fast, clipped notation he used when the market was loud and the air was wet, and he needed to remember something that would otherwise be rinsed from his mind before he could get back to ink. "Names on plastic," I said. "That feels wrong." "Names belong everywhere anyone can see them," Lucien said, "which is why men like the men we are trying to stay ahead of prefer not to write them down at all." At the corridor's end, another gate. No keyhole, just a cloth tied across 2 iron hooks. It was a strip of faded white, embroidered with a pattern like a knot. I touched it. The thread was coarse. My father, who couldn't sew a button back on a cuff without cursing at the needle as if it were an adversary, had not made this. But I had seen the pattern in his notebooks, a knot drawn over and over in margins when he was thinking, a knot drawn on the inside cover of a dictionary he kept to prop up a wobbly chair, a knot carved into the walnut underside of the counter in the shop where no customer would ever see it. "The ring," Lucien said behind me. I hesitated. "Nothing leaves here unless something stays," the ferryman said. "What stays?" "The idea that you are not the person who should be doing this," he said, not unkindly. I slid the ring from my finger. For the second time that night the air seemed to thicken, as if the city were paying attention but unwilling to declare it. I threaded the ring through the cloth's knot. It caught and sat there like a pupil in an absence. The cloth slackened the way rope does when it remembers a particular gravity, and the gate moved with a breath. Beyond, a room that should not have existed. It wasn't large, but it was finished. Not city finished. No municipal contractor had been paid to make this space. The walls were lined with cedar planks, and the ceiling had been brushed with lime wash that was flaking in the delicate, beautiful way that makes photographers lie to themselves about their relationship to poverty. On a table in the center, a ledger, not a laptop, not a stack of loose leaf, not some paranoid set of flash drives, A ledger, as in a book, with a spine of cracked leather and corners that had survived being knocked against surfaces too quickly. It was not dramatically chained to the table. There were no bells or tripwires, just a book that had learned patience by necessity. "Before you touch it," Lucien said, "say his name." "Why?" "Because he's the only one who paid for the right to be wrong inside this room," Lucien said. "Because names are tolls too." Bark. "It man," I said my father's name aloud, and it echoed back with the calm calculation of the space repeating what had just been spoken, so that it could be held responsible. I reached out. My hand shook. I put my fingers on the ledger, and flames did not shoot from the ceiling. The ferryman did not turn into a myth. Lucien did not stop me. The world did exactly what you never think it will do. It allowed me to proceed. The pages were thick and soft, lined with faint columns to guide exactness. The first entries were years old. Ship names I knew times me, an asterisk, golden reed asterisk, Tien Fat 2 times, and others that were jokes disguised as lists, times laundry asterisk, wedding cake asterisk, rain asterisk. Next to each, dates, depths, quantities, initials. I recognized some of the initials. A customs officer who used to bring my father mangoes in season. A woman who only ever ordered poetry anthologies and paid in a currency of favors. A developer whose name showed up in the papers often enough that he had started to believe the city's behavior happened at his request. This was not a list of crimes. It was a list of solutions that required crimes to arrange themselves like furniture. He cataloged the way the river has always been used, I said dully. He cataloged the way the city permits itself to continue, Lucien replied. It is not the same thing, but it requires the same pen. And I bleed. And Koa? I asked. Where is he in this? Lucien stepped to the other side of the table and tapped a page near the end. The handwriting there tilted harder, as if the hand had been asked to do a job it had promised itself it wouldn't. Near the margin, a note, smaller than the main entries, written like a prayer that didn't want to interrupt the business of survival. Asterisk, paid blood for passage, debt outstanding, mine. Asterisk, Koa insisted on honesty at the wrong moment, Lucien said, and for the first time, his voice sounded like heat might live under it. He took the boat out with 2 men who had been treating the sea like a ledger that would forgive them if they offered it returns. The sea does not forgive. It returns interest. What did he try to do? Refuse a job that required a girl to disappear, he said simply. He had seen too many of those. He thought a no could be made into a bridge. The men with him thought a no was a hole he had dug and that the water could fill. Who? I asked, but I already knew it didn't matter in the way names used for police reports matter. It only mattered in the way a city matters when it decides whose mother will have to hold which photograph. Lucien's gaze flicked to the page again, as if he could look hard enough to undo the ink's decision to stay where it had been put. The ledger has their initials, he said, but initials operate as disguises in both directions. You see only what you already think you know. Let me read it, I said. You should read it, he agreed. So I did. The ledger told me stories I had already half overheard. It told me where the city put things it couldn't say it wanted. It told me what the river swallowed and what it spat back out as if it were a dog who had been taught not to chew the expensive rug. It told me that my father was not the man I had made him to be after he died so I could continue to function as his daughter. It told me that my father was the man he had always been when I wasn't looking. Kind, yes. Stubborn, yes. Fluent in the ethics of triage. He had decided again and again which wrong would cause least harm to the most people. And then he had written those choices down because he believed writing is a promise made to future grief. When I reached the last page, a scrap of paper fell out and fluttered to the floor. Lucien didn't move. The ferryman, uncharacteristically, bent with surprising grace to pick it up and hand it to me with 2 fingers as if it were very hot or very cold. It was not my father's hand. The letters looped more, as if the writer liked the idea of words touching each other. Asterisk. If you're reading this, then I chose to leave the part of me that knows how to pull you into the same room I cannot share with you anymore. Asterisk. It was signed with an initial that was less a letter than a line that wanted you to guess. Koa, I said. It wasn't evidence. It was an intuition with teeth. Lucien put his palms flat on the table, leaned down, and closed his eyes for the space of a single breath. When he straightened, something had changed in the way his shoulders carried his head. He had become, suddenly, the man who refused 6 out of 7 shortcuts. We can't take the ledger out, he said. Not whole. The men who count like hawks will feel the air change in their chests. They tune their bodies to theft. What do we take? The parts that can warn. Not enough to explain, enough to complicate. He drew a blade from the small of his back with a gesture that made my skin consider goose flesh. The knife had the odd lack of ornament that mocked the part of the brain that expects it. He slid it beneath the thread binding of the ledger and pressed. The book made a quiet sound, a tiny complaint, like a low door hum. He removed 4 signatures, groups of folded pages that corresponded to dates within the last 18 months. The inspector will already be looking in the places you think are safe, he said. We need the kind of danger he can't explain to his men without losing their respect. Isn't that all danger? I asked. No, he said. There is danger that consolidates a crew around a project, and there is danger that reveals the project as an illusion. We must make them try to save a plan instead of a person. Plans drown very well. I eased the removed signatures into the waterproof sleeve I had brought for the unsent letter. The plastic crackled. For a moment, the strange domesticity of the act terrified me. We were stealing an architecture with the same care I used to pack signed copies for a favorite customer. Now the toll, the ferryman said, not looking at us, looking at the water that rubbed the platform's edge like a cat with a complaint. I slid the letter, Koa's letter, the one I had never opened, out of its sleeve. It had yellowed in the way paper that hides does. The corners were still sharp. My name, my full name, the one my father used only when he wanted me to choose the less useful virtue, was written across it in a hand I knew from grocery lists and from a single note taped to my door the last night. We were both young. I can't, I said softly. The confession lifted a little pressure from my skull. You must choose the cost, or the river will choose it for you, the ferryman said. It is very thorough in its accounting. I held the envelope as if it were the edge of a building. I had kept this letter precisely so I would not have to know what was inside. Not knowing had been a kind of power. When something can't be opened, it's also something that can't be harmed. But the river is a miser with that kind of power. It eats it for breakfast. What if I open it? I asked. To no one and to both. Then you may not be able to spend it as currency, the ferryman said. Grief is money only when it is still sealed. Lucien's gaze found mine. I could not read the expression that passed across his face in that moment. It wasn't pity, it wasn't demand. It might have been kinship, the reluctant kind two people feel when they recognize that the same myth has trained its bow on them. "Your call," he said. The city in my chest made a sound like a match being torn across a rough surface. I took a breath that did not help and another that did not either, then held the letter out over the water. My hand shook. The envelope trembled in the air like surrender. I remembered the pier and the salt and the particular way Koa had laughed when he surprised himself. The ferryman murmured something in a language that was older than this city and younger than the river, and the water puckered its mouth like a child about to kiss a coin for luck. I let go. The letter landed without sound. The river took it down the way a magician palms a coin, swallowed, and made a very small, very satisfied exhale. It was ridiculous to feel lighter. I felt lighter, which is not to say I did not also feel as if something had been cut from me with a clean blade. "You bought our exit," the ferryman said. "You also bought yourself the right to read that letter forever without reading it. It will come back?" My voice broke on will. "No," the ferryman said, with kindness so plain it was indecent. "But you can read what you did." We replaced the ring in the knot. The cloth drew tight as a muscle. The notebook on the table seemed to lean slightly, as if it had made a private adjustment. On the wall, above the level of my eyes, a line of faint notches, 16 of them. I realized each represented a toll paid, a letter given, a name spoken. I wondered who had counted them, and whether my father had done the tally himself, and whether he had used one of the cheap pencils we kept in a cracked mug behind the register that I could never bring myself to throw away. We left the room with the book on the table and its absence in my bag arranged like a polite hostage. Water ran along the corridors in careful discipline, as if it had been told to be on its best behavior. Lucien re-knotted the cloth with a simple economy that made a little feeling unfurl low in my belly. I hate admiring competence when it belongs to someone I have decided not to trust. At the first set of steps, the ferryman paused, lifted a hand, and listened. He has a face that seems to be always listening. The river is a teacher in that way. "Men," he said. "2, maybe 3, ahead, at the platform." "They knew," Lucien said. "They always know," the ferryman said. "Afterwards, which means we need to make this not afterwards," Lucien said, and smiled that cut smile which belongs on a face made by nicer thoughts. "Elena, can you march without being seen?" "And far." "I can be someone else while walking," I said. "That usually does the trick." He gave me a look I could not decode quickly enough to be useful. Then he unspooled the rope completely. At the mouth of the passage, voices. The accent you hear when money needs you to feel tired while it counts itself. Flashlight beams washed along the far wall, wobbly because the hands holding them were used to solid ground. "Inspector," one voice called dubiously. "Don't name him," the other voice hissed. "He doesn't like the floor to write him down." I flattened myself against a wedge of brick and tile while the ferryman slid into the water like a thought you aren't ready to entertain. Lucien stepped out into the platform light with a swagger portable enough to be useful and useless in equal measure. "Problem, gentlemen," he called, cheerful as a bartender when the first glass is broken. "I took a wrong turn and found a door without a doorman." "Hands where we can see them," a third voice said, tired in the way that implies pleasure at becoming less tired violently. "What's in the bag?" "Laundry," Lucien said. "The weather lately." With infuriating competence, he positioned himself so that the beam struck him from the side, bright enough to wash the details out of his face. indirect enough to make him simply a shape with exquisite posture. I did not know whether he was smiling or inventing a new word for threat in a language that used knives as punctuation. "You're trespassing," the first voice attempted, and I thought, not a professional. Professionals don't narrate trespass. They convert it into math. "By all means," Lucien said, and took a step forward that would have been idiotic if the world had been operating under the normal rules of gravity. "Arrest me. Write me down. Make me a number you can show your mothers when they ask you what you do all night while they are sleeping badly." The beams jittered, uncertain. I used the permission embedded in their uncertainty to slip along the wall and past the men without touching them. Their shoulders were rigid with the discipline of people who want to stay alive in a story they no longer understand. "Who are you?" the second voice demanded. "Nobody," Lucien said lightly. "But nobody owns this part of town." The ferryman's hand came up from the water and closed on my ankle with the exact pressure of a question. I slid down the last step on my backside, landed in the boat's narrow belly, with a thud that the river swallowed with professional discretion. The ferryman's eyes, pale as bottled glass left too long in surf, met mine. He mouthed Time's quiet asterisk, as if I had any other intention. On the platform, boots scraped. The sound of a pistol being brought into the conversation with the sullen authority of inevitability. Lucien's silhouette turned, and in the turn there was a hesitation, and in the hesitation there was a decision that arrived like weather. "Shoot me," he said, suddenly bored. "But you'll have to do it very close. I insist on intimacy." "Don't move," the tired voice said, and took a step closer. A click. The small metal certainty of a slide racked back and home. The ferryman's hand, in the boat, found a lever near the stern. He flipped it. The rope that tethered us to the cleat made a sound like a violin string being plucked by an impatient god, then fell into the water like a snake that had died and remembered at the last second that it preferred being a rope. The boat kissed the platform, then recoiled with the dignity of a cat who knows you are not the right person to be touching it. The river reached up with one lazy palm and pulled. "Lucien," I whispered, too loud for anyone who could not hear everything to miss it. "I know," he said, to no one the men could see. He brought his hands together as if in prayer. The thinnest glint across his knuckles told me what he was doing. The little knife, a cousin of the larger one he had used on the ledger, flashed, then was gone. The men stepped forward. He stepped back, onto a damp patch I had not noticed earlier, his heel very specifically where his heel should be for the next part of the physics. He slipped. He fell with an oath in French, so soft it might have been a love letter sent to the floor. The tired gun laughed. I lunged up before the ferryman could stop me, hands on the platform, hauled. Lucien rolled, used the momentum of his own prone body like a lever, and slid off the edge in the split second between the men deciding to shoot him and deciding to keep him alive, to ask him questions that would make them feel taller. He hit the water in precisely the place the ferryman's hands expected him to hit. The river closed over his hair. The river opened over his mouth. The boat rocked as if another person had decided to join our argument without being invited. The men yelled wordless things. The beam shook and found only bricks and water and a life jacket hook. The ferryman's hand was on the engine's cord, and then the engine was awake, and then we were moving, and then the tunnels were not wide enough to hold the confusion we left behind. For an interval, measurable in heartbeats, and the width of the beam along the wall, we were all very quiet. The engine muttered. The water kept its secrets with exquisite manners. I put a hand on Lucien's arm where it rested on the edge of the boat. fingers finding the ridges of old scars as if reading them like Braille. He looked at me and grinned in a way that wanted to be cocky but had lost its nerve on the way to the surface. "You owe me a name for that," I said, "which is what you say when what you want to say is, 'I am glad you did not become a ledger entry in front of me.'" He laughed, water slipping down his neck in a way that made the lower part of my frontal cortex misfire. "You already have too many names," he said. We did not go back the way we came. The ferryman knows routes like a man who has been forced to memorize the arguments of dangerous people. We took a left into a narrower throat, then a right where a current did something subtle and bad, then straight until the air warmed, and the way the boat moved told me the water was wider and shallower. We passed a bar of light that slid across us, and I thought, storm drain. The city sang above us without knowing its lungs were being used for our breathing. When we emerged, it was not towards the river but into a canal behind a row of warehouses that had never recovered from the day the economy decided to change its perfume. The sky had learned gray in the interim between tunnels, and now dawn was slicing itself into pieces and handing them out grudgingly. Birds performed the same plan they always perform: be louder than disappointment. The city had not put on its face yet. It was drinking tea with its hair uncombed. "Where?" I asked the ferryman, which I realized was a stupid question for a person whose answer to where is always on the water. He pointed with his chin at a stairway that climbed out of the canal and into a courtyard made of cracked tile and the sort of plants that thrive because no one told them they were supposed to be ornamental. "Home," he said. "For who?" I asked, but my voice turned into a cough. The air above ground had opinions. "For people who have to put things back where they found them," he said. There was a door at the top of the stairs with peeling blue paint and a brass knocker in the shape of a carp swallowing its own tail. Lucien rapped it twice in a rhythm that probably means something to people who were born into professions instead of chosen by them later under duress. A woman opened the door. She was short and composed of exactly as much presence as a person can be composed of without being declared a deity. Her hair had gone white in the way of women who refuse to negotiate with time unless time brings flowers. Her eyes were exactly my height and exactly the temperature of a cup of tea that has decided it is ready for your mouth now. "I see you brought someone's daughter to my kitchen," she said to Lucien, not unkindly, but with a moral inventory I could feel performing math on my person. "Take off your wet." "This is Elena," Lucien said, as if the fact of me proxied for everything he did not yet know how to explain. "I know who she is," the woman said. "You smell like your father's shop, paper and stubbornness. To me, I am Quinn. You may call me Auntie, because all women our age who have not had children have earned at least that word from a girl with good eyes. I don't cry in front of strangers. I have trained myself not to since the day after my father died, when the landlord sat on the teak stool he borrowed from our neighbor and drew me a map of the kind of patience he would require from me if I wanted to keep the shop. But sometimes words cut through training like a boat cuts through floating hyacinth asterisk. Auntie Times lodged itself under my sternum and shone. "We need to dry the pages," Lucien said quietly, and opened the waterproof sleeve enough for the smell of old ink and prevented disaster to lift a fraction. "In my oven," Auntie said. "The gas one, not the electric. Electricity tells secrets to men you are trying to avoid." We crossed into a kitchen tiled in sky colors. The smell was of fish sauce and star anise and baking. On a rack by the window, small cakes, pale golden, cooling themselves for someone's morning. A radio muttered to itself. On the wall, a framed photograph of a young man holding a motorbike helmet and smiling like he believed this century would be kind. He looked enough like Koa that I had to close my eyes to place him as someone else. "Your nephew?" I asked. "My husband," she said, and the word had the relaxed discipline of 40 years behind it. "The one who lived, the other one keeps the river tidy with his bones." I sat down without meaning to. My knees had adopted their own policy. Auntie put a porcelain cup in front of me and filled it with tea, thick and red. She touched the back of my hand with her fingers, just the tips, the way one tests a fruit at the market. "You paid with a letter," she said. "How do you—" "I taught the ferryman not to pretend he knows how to cook," she said. "He pretends less now, but he still thinks water is an ingredient separate from other water. It makes his rice anxious. He told me before he told you, because men always tell the person who feeds them what they did, so that if they fail, they will not be forgotten by the mouth that knows their salt." "I didn't open it," I said too defensively. "The opening happens," she said mildly, "when you let go." Lucien stood by the oven, laying the signatures on an enamel tray lined with baking paper as if making pastries for a god with bureaucratic taste. He didn't look at me. He looked at the pages as at the face of a child that might be his. Auntie adjusted the flame. She slid the tray inside and propped the door open with a spoon so the heat kissed instead of enveloped. "If the inspector is in his office," she said, "you have 3 hours. If he is not, you have 1. "He was standing up," Lucien said. His men were borrowing his posture. "Then 2, she said, and went to the sink to wash her hands in a way that made washing hands seem like a ritual for keeping secrets rather than a hygiene practice. "What inspector?" I asked. "The man the city hired to make its conscience official," Auntie said. "The man the river hired to remember who owes what." Lucien smirked without humor. "Noain Dan calls himself inspector, as if the word were vertically integrated with his bones. Put a suit on a storm and teach it to draft memos." "He's the one who sent the men?" I asked. "He's the one who owns the men who sent themselves, because owning the idea of a man doing his job is very efficient," Auntie said, placing a saucer on top of my cup. "He will come speak to you in the tone a knife uses when it wants you to forget you have skin." "He's spoken to me," I said, "twice, about my father's imaginary ledger. He brought me plants both times." "Ah," Auntie said, "he tried to domesticate you into confession. When that fails, they bring bread." "And he brought a kombucha SCOBY and a fiddle-leaf fig," I said. She laughed, wickedly. "He brought you a pet and a child. He is a man with no sisters." Something loosened in me, a knot aligning itself with the one engraved on the ring that was no longer on my finger. "What do we do now?" "We let the pages dry," Lucien said, "and then we take them to someone who can make them dangerous in a way that becomes public without becoming predictable." "Which means a small newspaper edited by a man who is brave because he's old enough to choose not to be and still gets up early," he said. "And a seamstress who does the accounts for half this block and notarizes confessions while fitting trousers." "The seamstress?" I said. "Auntie," she smiled, "children think we live only in the rooms we show them. I have drawers you have not opened yet." I drank the tea. It tasted like an apology being exquisite enough to accept. In the oven, the edges of the paper curled back into their trained habit of being flat. Damp stole away. Ink remembered that its job was to lie down and behave. Lucien turned the tray and turned it again with a tenderness that made my body write poetry under my clothes without asking my permission. "You never answered my question," I said into the small, credentialed domesticity of the kitchen. "How did you know about Koa's letter? How did you know to ask for the ring? How did you—" A knock interrupted me. Not a hurried fist, a measured sequence that belonged to someone for whom doors were never closed long enough to be considered obstacles. Auntie didn't freeze. She set down the towel and adjusted her blouse with the dignity of a soldier going from mess to parade. Lucien's eyes cut to the oven, then to the back door, then to me. He shook his head once. "Stay!" Auntie opened the door. Inspector Nguyen Dan stood there, wearing a pale suit that made his skin look darker in a way I suspect he found useful. He carried nothing in his hands except a pen, which is the most dangerous thing a man like that can carry openly. "Auntie Quinn," he said, with the charm of a man who does not need to believe his charm is real, "your cakes smell like patience." "Patience is cheaper than sugar," she said, stepping aside without inviting him to step inside. He stepped inside. He did not look at me first. He looked at the oven, at the tray, at the way the pages sat upon it like truths cooling themselves, and he smiled with the sad happiness of a man who has just learned that the story he was telling himself about the day will have to be revised without changing any of the characters. "Miss Elena," he said at last, turning to locate me where I sat, because there aren't many places to sit in Auntie's kitchen unless you are allowed to. "Your father loved letters. Did you inherit the same habit?" "I inherited his bills," I said. "Bills, letters, two kinds of promises that assume the future will cooperate," he said, and moved to the table as if it were his. "Inspector," Lucien said, in that mellow theater voice from the shop, "you made good time." "I like mornings," the inspector replied. "Everything that can be bent hasn't warmed up enough to resist." "Careful," Auntie said, setting a plate of cakes in the center of the table with surgical force. "You'll spill metaphor on my floor, and then someone will slip." He looked at her with real affection. It made him more frightening. Men who can love and still proceed are the ones myths recruit. "You have my pages," he said to me. "No pretense, no circling. I will need to see them before they are dressed for the public." "Haddo, and so?" "No," I said, because sometimes the only strategy left is the small one that says no and then swallows. "Then my men will bring me grief," he said mildly, "and I will spend it. On you, on your shop, on the ferryman's boat, on Lucien's debt, on Auntie's husband's photograph. You see the menu. I see a man who keeps lists in his head because he is ashamed to keep them on paper," Lucien said. The inspector scratched his eyebrow with the pen cap. "Paper is for men who can afford to be blamed later. I prefer to be blamed in the moment. It is more honest and easier to get over." The oven ticked like a clock improvising. The kitchen smelled briefly of singeing, then of saved. "What is it you think you are saving?" the inspector asked me, almost conversational. "The city? The river? Your father's dignity? None of these are threatened?" "Not really. The ledger is a tool, Miss Elena. With it, we can prevent certain storms from bringing us exactly the wrong boats. Without it, men will invent ledgers inside their skulls. Those are worse. They do not balance." "And the girl?" I asked, surprised at my own mouth for having asked. "The one Koa tried to refuse disappearing?" He looked at me properly then, and the charm left the room the way electricity leaves a village when someone decides to sell the generator. "She is alive," he said, and the pronoun sat on the table like a cat deciding whether or not to be touched. She is alive because men like me keep lists outside the law. The law is a dog who comes when it is called. It does not know how to swim. You want the ledger so you can continue to put girls on lists, Auntie said, folding a cloth with precise contempt. I want the ledger, he said, so that I am the one who decides who belongs to which list. If you prefer the alternative, if you prefer dozens of men keeping small, inaccurate ledgers in their pockets and paying their debts with other people's bodies, I can step back. The city will do as she always does. She will be polite. She will forget you taste. Lucien moved. Not much. A slide of weight. The kind of movement that is only a movement to people who understand the timeline of violence. Eat a cake, Auntie said. Not to be kind, but to remind everyone that we are not animals unless we choose to be. It makes men momentarily less efficient. He took one, bit, nodded. You butter them more than you used to. I am better at not apologizing than I used to be, she said. Miss Elena, the inspector said to me politely, you paid the ferryman with a letter. He will tell me he did not tell me so, but he always tells me everything he thinks he has not told me. That is our arrangement. It is Bai's. You don't control him, I said. No, he said, but he prefers to be controlled more than once a day. It reminds him he is loved. I looked past him at Lucien, and in that look was the admission I had been avoiding even inside my own body. I wanted very much to place my mouth on his. It was an unwanted thought, in the way heartbeat is an unwanted sound when you're trying to listen for something small. Want is a combustion engine. It doesn't care if you remember how to drive. If I give you these pages, I said slowly, what will you do? I will take them to a safe place and then leak them slowly to the men who like to read what hurts other men, he said with hotline calm. I will preserve your father's notebook. I will make sure your shop remains unvisited by fire. I will grant your ferryman his favorite delusion, which is that he is necessary, and I will pay Lucien in what he pretends he does not want. What is that? I asked. A name? The inspector said. Lucien's jaw went tight. He looked at the tray, not at the inspector. He looked at me, not at the tray. He looked at the inspector, not at me. The sequence made a logic I recognized without agreeing to. You can keep controlling this, I said to the inspector, only if I believe you when you tell me what you'll do with what I give you. You don't have to believe me, he said. You only have to believe that you cannot control it alone. He's right, Auntie said unexpectedly, and I felt the floor lose a degree of inclination. No one person holds a city's hair back when she throws up. You're amusing, the inspector said softly, but her answer is already written, because she is her father's daughter, and he always chose the laver over the prayer. Get out, Lucien said finally, and his voice had the kind of composure that excuses itself just outside the door and throws up. The inspector smiled like a man who has learned which parts of smiling make people think they could like him someday if he were less himself. He set the cake down. He took a napkin and wiped his fingers. He slid the pen back into his jacket pocket. He looked at me and very gently shook his head in the smallest no I had ever seen. 2 hours, he said. After that, I will take my pages from whatever oven they are cooling in. When he left, the kitchen expanded. I hadn't realized it had shrunk to fit his suit. Auntie exhaled. Lucien swore in a dialect that might have been his, might have belonged to someone whose life he had borrowed for a season. I hate him less when he is honest, Auntie said. It makes hating him untidy. He's going to get what he wants, I said. My hands had started to shake again, even though the difficult part, I thought, had passed. He is going to get times something asterisk, Lucien said. But the thing is not finished wanting him. It will eat him while he eats, and neither of them will admit it is happening. What do you want, Lucien? I asked, because the room had become very small, and I needed the answer to be larger than the oven. I want, he said, and paused, and I watched him try on several lies and discard them out of respect for the arrangement grief had made with us, to make sure the part of you that trusts things stays alive long enough to be useful. That's not the same as wanting me, I said. He smiled then, without theater, which is how some men kiss from across a table. No, he said, it is worse. Auntie turned off the oven. The pages no longer glistened. She slid them into a bag that formerly held rice and now held a portion of the city's proof. She put the bag in my hands. It weighed more than paper and less than justice. You'll go to Noir, she said. The street paper that pretends to sell classified ads to disguise the classifieds it actually sells. Ask for Uncle Tung. He will ask you if you are very sure you will not be. That is fine. Then come back here. We will eat soup. We will decide again. That is how days work when you are not lying to yourself about how many decisions a day contains. Lucien took my elbow the way a man does when he has learned women don't like it. He didn't lead. He accepted that I would walk. The ferryman was already gone, which is how ferrymen say, I love you to a city. The courtyard was bright with morning. The blue of the door looked temporarily like a promise. Wait, I said on the threshold, surprising myself. The ring. Auntie's gaze altered its angle, and I realized she had already removed it from the cloth when we were not looking, because that is when real work is done. She brought it out, palmed it once like a magic trick she refuses to perform any more, and set it in my palm. If you keep it, she said softly, it will keep you. That is not the same as keeping you safe. I know, I said, which was not true and has never been true for anyone who has ever said it. I slid the ring onto my finger. It felt like a door closing the way a mouth closes around a confession. We left Auntie's courtyard into a city that was busy pretending to be normal. Vendors sang their wares. Motorbikes insisted. Children walked to school with backpacks shaped like animals that would be extinct by the time they could afford to go to other schools. I concentrated on breathing and on keeping the bag from getting wet and on walking like a person who had not tipped a currency made of grief into a river. Tell me what I am missing, I said to Lucien, as we shouldered through a knot of tourists wearing the identical confidence of people who believe exchange rates make them invincible. You are missing, he said, the difference between a man who collects proof and a man who needs proof to tell himself he is right. And you? I am a man who no longer needs to be right, he said. It is not virtue, it is an injury. You were going to tell me how you knew Koa, I said, and the name is a trapdoor I stepped through on purpose. He didn't answer right away. He didn't look at me. He walked with me the way the city teaches you to walk with anyone you have decided to love against your better judgment. Shoulder near shoulder, the two of you making space in motion that would not exist if either of you were alone. We worked for the inspector before he became the inspector, he said at last, when he was only a man who made safe routes with his voice and with the votes he could borrow with that voice. Koa navigated the water. I navigated the rooms upstairs. Your father documented the inventory of both. He wasn't our boss. He was our ledger that knew how to speak. You left, I said. Cora died, he said, and I felt the syllables cut like a square of metal in a coil of wire. I learned that loyalty is a profession that doesn't pay as well as its interviews suggest. I left the day the inspector announced he preferred oceans to rivers. Men who prefer oceans always want empires. Rivers require neighbors. And now you're— What? I asked. Now, he said, I am the letter he could not send, and the knife someone else trained my hand to use when I would rather use a pen. We reached the district where the small newspapers live under awnings and behind cafe counters and inside houses that smell of ink and boiled morning. I paused at the door that looked least like it could be breached. Ready? Lucien asked, and the word was generous. No, I said, and opened it. Inside, the air was damp with newsprint. A radio argued with itself. A man at a desk looked up, his glasses fogged, his mouth in a smile that assumed good faith and adjusted for disappointment. He had a face that begged to be forgiven for being curious. Uncle Tung? I asked. Only if you brought rice wine, he said. Otherwise I am merely Tung, who edits other people's mistakes into stories. He saw the bag and his face stopped smiling in order to become a different instrument. Is that what I think it smells like? Hey, Sate, it smells like proof, I said, which is not a smell, but everyone in the room pretended it was. He took the pages as if they were a sleeping child. He did not ask where they came from. He did not ask whether my father would have wanted this. He asked for a towel. He dried his hands very carefully before touching them. I will read, he said, and then I will tell you I cannot print this. Then I will print it in the way that keeps me from dying, which is to say I will teach it to walk instead of letting it run. You have 2 hours, I said. That is a lot of time, he said cheerfully, for men like me who pretend we are in a hurry because it keeps our bones from telling us what they are planning. Lucien stood behind me like a sentence I hadn't decided whether to say. When we stepped back into the street, the city had opened fully. I felt, absurdly, that she was watching me not with malice, not even with interest, but the way a teacher watches a classroom full of children from whom she has learned to expect an artful mediocrity and who sometimes attempt excellence out of boredom. We leaned under an awning and watched rain that had not been permissioned gather itself briefly and then change its mind. Lucien's shoulder barely touched mine. My body behaved like an idiot. I wanted his mouth. I wanted something else more. The part of him that had not invented his own name, the part that had sat at a table with Koa and laughed at something small and human and useless. You can kiss me, I said, and the power in the sentence shocked me because I had forgotten I could decide where certain doors go. He turned his face to mine in that steady way he had, no rush, no theater, as if kissing were a thing that deserved the same gravity he subsisted on. When his mouth met mine, the city did not break out into applause. The river did not stand up. Auntie did not emerge with a broom and chase us down the alley. He kissed me like a man who had learned enough about not wanting to want how. It was not gentle, but it was exact. It informed me that he had acquired certainty through damage, and that he would attempt to use that certainty only when asked. When we broke, the air seemed to have to catch up to us. That was a bad idea, I said. All good ideas begin in rooms where bad ones have laid down their coats, he said, smiling for the first time in a way that belonged to him. It changes nothing, I said, and knew I was lying. It changes whether you will sleep tonight, he said, and he was not wrong. A motorbike roared left at the end of the lane. Men got off it who had practiced getting off motorbikes in such a way that the getting off itself was a threat. Lucien's posture altered. Mine did not. I am no good at violence until it starts, and then I am adequate. He had told me this with his eyes earlier without telling me at all. They will want a witness, he murmured. Give them one who says nothing. The men walked toward us with the confidence of people who assume endings resemble beginnings if one looks from afar while squinting. The taller one, the one with a nose that had been corrected more than once by fists who did not agree with it, looked at me as if I were on a menu he would like to order if he were less full. Elena, he said, as if the name were a coin he needed change for. The inspector would like to see you again. He says he regrets the lack of kombucha. I prefer tea, I said, almost sweetly, and then the ferryman's boat came around the corner of the lane. This was impossible in any traffic diagram the city had ever printed, but the ferryman is not an employee of diagrams. He sat in the boat like a question mark in a sentence no teacher would grade. Children on the sidewalk laughed and clapped because a boat on a road is an excellent story. The men paused, briefly converted into the audience their mothers had told them they would spend their lives pretending not to be. Get in, the ferryman called, as if he were offering a ride to a cousin after a wedding. You're late for the part where we don't die. Lucien took my hand. This time I did not pretend I could do better alone. We stepped into the boat. The ferryman revved an engine no city planner had authorized. Water found us, in the way water does when a man has a pact with it that the river pretends it doesn't approve of. The men on the motorbike reached for their guns. A woman selling Bonzio shouted at them for frightening her granddaughter. The ferryman took a corner that made no sense if space were lawful, and then we were elsewhere, and I remembered that the city's rules are merely suggestions until someone invents a reason to ignore them that is more interesting than the old reasons. Lucien squeezed my fingers once, hard, and let go. Tell me you trust me, he said, not because he needed to hear it, but because he needed to know what I thought I was doing. I trust, I said, and it felt like buying something without knowing whether you could afford it. I trust that I will regret not having trusted you sooner. He laughed, delighted. That's deeply unhealthy, he said. I like it. He had dares. The boat slid back into the canal, where Auntie's courtyard watched what it could not prevent. We stepped out into a morning that had already forgotten to be polite. Auntie waited in the doorway, her face the expression all large women in cities have when children they do not entirely own return from doing things that will make new rules necessary. Well? She asked. Well, I said. She nodded, as if I had reported something she already knew. Soup, she said, and then the inspector, and then your father's ledger again. Doors that refuse to be only doors don't close on the first try. Will we, I asked her, my voice small in my own mouth, pay again? Bili panarent savri salvi. When that sation 70 they savri 70 wire. We always pay again, she said gently. The trick is to choose the currency before someone else does. In the kitchen, the radio announced rain in the afternoon, as if rain were a surprise. Auntie emptied broth over noodles as if she were spooning weather onto plates. Lucien leaned against the counter and pretended he had never kissed me. I pretended I had never cared. The ring on my finger warmed. The city arranged her hair. The river rehearsed her lines. Somewhere, on a page that could still be torn out, my father had written my name in ink that had not yet dried, because grief is not sequential. Somewhere, an inspector with a gentle voice and a war for a spine sharpened a pen that had scratched the names of men he would later claim not to remember. Somewhere, Koa, who is still at sea even when he is in kitchens and in my mouth, and in the way the ferryman tilts his head when he says times toll asterisk, folded a paper boat and set it afloat on a puddle like a boy being forgiven for his mother's superstition. I ate soup. It tasted like the thing you eat when you have run out of pretending and have gone back to surviving. Lucien watched me and did not watch me. Auntie refilled my bowl without asking whether I wanted more. The day lifted itself and began. It occurred to me, very clearly, that love might not be a person in this story. It might be a ledger. It might be the river. It might be the knot on a ring. It might be the door that refuses to be only a door. It might be this: the ledger waiting for us not to be ready, the city being polite until she isn't, and me, the one who keeps what was never meant for her, learning the difference between keeping and holding, and one day, perhaps, letting go without paying everything I have left. Chapter 3. The Arithmetic of After. It rained like the city had been reminded of an old debt. The afternoon storm arrived when the radio said it would. Precise, not personal, unapologetic. We carried bowls to the sink as if dishes were the same kind of duty as betrayal. Auntie tightened her apron strings, and the knot she made resembled the one etched in my ring, the one that keeps saying door when it means bond. Eat one more bite, she told me, which is how older women in this city tell you not to make decisions you can't take back on an empty stomach. I obeyed, because obedience is sometimes just a motion you give your hands so your head can go on pretending it's in charge. Lucien wiped his mouth and set the chopsticks down parallel, a soldier's punctuation. Then he took out his pocket notebook and wrote something on the inside of the back cover. He didn't show me. He tore the page carefully along the perforation and tucked it under the salt jar as if salting words made them keep longer. "What is it?" I asked, immediately wishing I had waited to ask later, when asking might look like mercy instead of appetite. "An address," he said, "in case the river takes me somewhere I cannot give directions from." Auntie clicked her tongue. Part prayer, part censure. Don't talk like a boy who wants to be missed. Men who want to be missed throw themselves in front of vehicles. Men who want to be necessary learn to cook. He smiled to appease her. It worked and didn't. At 2, Uncle Tung sent a boy with ink on his fingers. The boy stood in Auntie's doorway, dripping confidence and rainwater, and said, "He wants to see you. He wants to see if you understand a headline." The boy's teeth were college bright. He was too young to be the kind of messenger who plans for his own death. We went. The street had turned itself into a gray river, shallow, bossy, familiar. Children launched paper boats that drowned deliberately. Women lifted pant legs and laughed at the ends of sentences as if punctuation were the enemy. We were only 2 alleys away when we saw the men with the wrong umbrellas, too black for weather, too exact for rain. Inspector Nguyen Dan stepped out from between them like a joke with a good tailor. "Miss Elena," he said, "you were headed to read how someone else will tell your story." "They'll tell the cities," I said. "Which one?" he asked, genuinely curious. "The polite one or the one under the table?" "Both," I said, because I hadn't yet learned that both is a word that always costs. He gestured toward a cafe whose metal shutters had been raised just enough to make entering feel like an invitation that wanted you to say no. Inside, the air smelled of condensed milk and stolen attention. He sat at a table in the corner, the kind of corner men choose when they know what men who choose corners are trying to avoid. "I like to keep conversations in rooms where cups can break," he said. "It makes everyone careful." "No kombucha," I said, almost kindly. He looked pained. I was dyslexic with sincerity that day. Lucien remained standing. The inspector looked up at him with the indulgence of a father watching a son refuse to sit at a ceremony. "Still growing?" he asked lightly. "I'm done," Lucien said. "Tragic," the inspector said. "The world needs more men who are finished." He turned to me. "Uncle Tung will print." I expected as much. He will soften names with ellipses and sharpen dates with italics. He thinks typography is a law. Let him. I will arrest him by dinner time, release him by midnight, and bring him a ham in the morning. He will print again next week with less courage and more style. That is the exchange rate he understands. "You can't arrest a man for punctuation," I said. "You can arrest a man for air," he said gently. "If you can persuade a judge, he stole it." A woman behind the counter dropped a glass. It shattered politely. Everyone paused, then proceeded. "The city has made a profession of that pause." "You want me to give you the ledger?" I said. "Because sometimes you have to step onto the trap door and look down on purpose." "I want you to choose the version of ruin you can live with," he said. "If the ledger is drowned, other ledgers will be born, inside smaller skulls. If it lives in your shop, my men will take it with their hands. If you give it to the river publicly, you will be applauded privately and punished in the ways that matter. If you give it to me, the punishment will be curated. I am excellent at curation." "You're not a museum," Lucien said. "I am a weather system with an index," the inspector replied. He folded his hands around the pen. "I can keep girls alive." "The girl is alive?" I asked. The question tore my mouth on the way out. "In a way most people cannot sustain," he said. "Alive is not a whole word. It never has been. She is in my house." Danpari. I felt something tilt wrong inside me, like a shelf bracket that has been temporarily repurposed as a load-bearing wall. "Your house? I am not a monster," he said, blandly. "But monsters like to borrow my face. It fits them." "Why?" I asked. "Why keep her there?" "Because men who miscount her are looking for her," he said, "and because I do not trust shelters that ask for paperwork." "What do you want, Dan?" Lucien asked, and the use of the inspector's given name was a slap a friend is permitted to land in public if he can bear the price later. "I want a city that admits what she is," he said. "I want water that doesn't pretend to be a law. I want paper that chooses sides. I want the ledger to belong to no one and to everyone, which means it has to belong, for a while, to me." Lucien laughed quietly, and I recognized the shape of the sound, the laugh a man makes when he loves a person he is going to betray because the person has already betrayed him in a better suit. "I want to see the girl," I said. He blinked, surprised. "Now?" "Yes, you have errands. Your father's notebook has a room to return to." "I want to see her." He studied me. You could see the math running. Then he nodded once, the sort of nod men give when they are about to allow a precedent. "We go by boat," he said. "On purpose?" I asked, before remembering who I was talking to. "On purpose," he said. "We took the canal without Auntie's blessing because blessings slow men who are not used to them and arm men who are. The ferryman met us at a culvert where the water knew our names. He didn't pretend to be surprised this time." "You rarely bring him," he told the inspector, faintly amused. "He rarely asks nicely," the inspector said. "You rarely deserve it," the ferryman replied, and pushed us off like a bad idea he had decided to sponsor. We slid under a bridge whose graffiti represented entire political movements in 4 colors and 3 misspellings. The rain freckled the surface, each circle a punctuation mark arguing for a different sentence. The inspector sat very straight. He does not slouch. His spine considers that a breach of contract. "Does she know who you are?" I asked. "She knows who I am to her," he said. "That is the only knowledge that should be compulsory." "You talk like a monk when you need to," Lucien murmured. "Do you build temples for yourself or only for others?" "For lists," the inspector said, not offended. "Temples are for people who plan to be remembered. Lists are for people who plan to remain necessary." The house was not a house. It was a museum of restraint behind a factory that pretended to be asleep. The rain made a pearl curtain of the eaves. The inspector took us through a side door into a hallway that smelled of dry rot and lemon oil. He did not look behind him to see if we were following. Men like that assume the gravitational field of their choices will do the work for them. He paused at a door and touched his fingers to the lintel in an old habit. The gesture was either a superstition or an apology. He knocked once, a sound you make when you are not asking permission so much as teaching the air a rhythm. She opened the door. She had the face of a person whose first word had been no, and whose most recent word was, "I'll try." She was small in the way prey animals are small, built to fit through spaces a predator cannot consider because the predator's imagination is larger than its neck. Her hair was shaved close, not by fashion but by necessity. Her eyes were wolf-bright. "This is Elena," the inspector said. "She had a friend who died trying to make sure you were a complication." She tilted her head. Her gaze passed over my ring, my shoulders, the newer stiffness in my mouth. She nodded once. "He was kind," she said, as if that were the reason we were all inside this room and not out there drowning in more interesting weather. "What do you want?" I asked, and felt stupid. Want is an insult when asked of people who have already had their verbs taken from them. "To leave," she said, and then softer, as if betraying the loyalty she had pledged to her own survival. "After it is safe to be seen again." "We don't make safe," Lucien said. "We only make safer and then watch it leak." She looked at him properly then, and something in her face altered. "You were with him," she said, "on the boat." He did not deny it. He did not confess. He let his eyes do the work that verbs cannot. She nodded. "He told me a joke," she said. "It wasn't funny." Then, oddly, she smiled, and the smile was a precise reproduction of a moment that had happened somewhere no one wrote down. "What would make it safe?" I asked the inspector, knowing I had declared an algebra problem no one here had the chalk for. "Time," he said. "And the ledger," Lucien added. "And the ledger," the inspector agreed, "whichever version survives this week." "Then we should drown it," I said. I didn't recognize my voice. It had moved into a lower room and closed the door. Not the pages we took. The book, the rest. Let the city remember the way she is accustomed to remembering, inaccurately, with devotion. He would own. The inspector stared at me, as if I had set a bird on the table and asked him to categorize it as furniture. "You want to give up your father's hand." "I want to give up what men will use my father's hand to excuse," I said. The words came out clean and did not ask my permission to remain once they were in the room. "He bound a story he is no longer here to disown. I am. It was never his job to be holy. It is my job not to make his ledger into a shrine." The girl, she had not told me her name, and I did not ask, watched my face when I said it, and I felt the weight of her attention like a crown I hadn't earned. "She is right," she said. The inspector put both palms flat on the edge of the desk, looking briefly like a man about to pray to wood. "If we drown it," he said, "we also drown my ability to keep my lists honest." "You keep your lists honest by not letting them be the only lists," Lucien said. "You keep them honest by permitting witnesses you do not own." He looked at Lucien a long time, the way you look at a landmark you thought you had already passed. "I could arrest you again," he said. "You could try," Lucien said, smiling thinly. "But you would have to do it close." The inspector's mouth twitched. "You never tire of making proximity into a weapon." "It's the only geography I'm good at," Lucien said. The girl turned to me. "If you drown it," she said, "make it public. Not the drowning, but the reason. Make everyone know that the book exists, so that anyone who tries to make another will have to admit they're copying." "Yes," the inspector said softly, as if she had given him an answer he could live with without having to pretend to be a better man than the one he was. "Make the absence famous." We looked at each other in a way that made a tiny, reluctant alliance sit down between us, knees touching, hands on knees. Then I said, "We do it tonight. Before the paper hits the street, before your men perform their choreography, ejebios." A plan unfolded the way paper boats do when the water finally convinces them they were trees once and could be again if they would only admit it. We would take the ledger still in its cedar-walled room, still pretending to be patient to the flood mouth where the tunnels drink. We would invite witnesses who didn't know they were witnesses. We would pay the river in a coin it cannot counterfeit. "What coin?" the ferryman asked later. When we told him, because every plan must be told to the man who will persuade water to respect it long enough for it to become history. His wrists smelled of rope and lemon peel. "The ring," I said, before I knew I had decided to say it. "The ring isn't yours to spend," Auntie said, alarmed, then caught herself in the mirror of her own contradiction. "Of course it is. That is why you are trying not to." "It's only metal," I said, and the ring warmed on my finger in protest. It was a promise that failed to arrive. I would like to convert it back into a promise. "The river accepts jewelry," the ferryman said judiciously. "She is vain. She likes to be adorned." "Will it be enough?" Lucien asked him. "Grief pays the fare," the ferryman said. "The ring buys you a cleaner story." Then the letter, "You surrendered that," he reminded me gently. "And the river was generous. And the inspector did not come to Auntie's courtyard. He said he would meet us at the mouth. He said it like a man arranging to be at the altar without wasting time on the vows. Auntie made us drink something caramel and dark and told us not to mistake numb for strong. She put her palm on my cheek, and the whole city leaned briefly into that touch. Dusk found us walking the way people walk to funerals, briskly, as if not to miss an appointment, then slowly, as if more time might be found in the air if we wrung it. The sky had put on purple the way a bruise pretends it has considered aspirational colors. The city smelled like rain and fried shallots and fear the color of marigolds. At the quay, the ferryman waited with the boat pressed close to the steps like a dog who has learned refusing is a poor strategy. Lucien climbed in and offered me a hand. I took it because pride is a scarf you cannot keep dry on a wet night. We moved into the mouth, the tunnel swallowing us without comment. Somewhere above, electricity told apartments their stories. Somewhere behind, Auntie turned down the radio because drama ruined soup. None of us spoke until the chamber with the cedar walls and the lime-washed ceiling peeled itself from the dark like a scar, admitting the event. The cloth knotted between the hooks looked like it had tied itself more tightly since we left it last, as if fabric can learn to anticipate. I slid the ring out of its knot. The cloth released with a sigh that made me think of my father, my mother, and a life that could have been another and therefore qualifies as fiction. We did not sit. We did not open the ledger to read our names being manipulated. We lifted it together, Lucien and I, and it felt like lifting an ancestor, gentle and indefensible. The ferryman took the rear, his hands under the spine. The book smelled of cedar and mildew and ink's difficult ethics. "Where?" I asked, though the plan had made this part obvious. "Where the city learns how to forget," the ferryman said. "The river room at the mouth is not a room. It is an argument. Concrete gives up there. Metal learns humility. The water arrives from 3 directions and does not choose until the last possible second." The inspector stood on the platform when we entered, his suit dark now in ways the color wheel cannot classify. 2 of his men stood back, eyes averted, hands correct. He had come alone in the way men come alone when the men they are have been told this is a private matter. "You can still change your mind," he said. Not to try to change it, but to earn the right later to say he had offered. "You can give it to me and we will drown it together in a law." "We're drowning it in a law," I said, "just not one the city has ratified." "The river's constitution is older," the ferryman added, sad and proud at once. We went to the lip. The ledger in my hands grew heavier the way babies do after they fall asleep. Weight, deciding to be real now that performance is done. I thought of my father's hands, the hair on the backs of them like pencil shavings, the place where a scar ran from his thumb into his palm where a glass had broken the year I turned 10. I thought of the day he taught me the trick of dampening a finger to turn a thin page without tearing it. I thought of how many times he had written my name and erased it and written it again, inside his head on a list of facts it would have shamed him to call love. "Say it," Lucien whispered. "His name?" I asked. "Yours," he said. "Elena," I said. Into the chamber, into the mouth, into the ledger, into the inspector's listening, into the ferryman's oath. To my surprise, the name sounded like it belonged to a person I could stand to meet. "Now," the ferryman said, and I slid the ledger into the water. It did not splash. It accepted. The river took it the way a friend takes a burden you've finally admitted you can't carry and says nothing, because saying nothing is the only correct ceremony. The book ascended a little as the trapped air argued, then descended in a series of decisions. It turned once, briefly, to show us its spine, the way an animal shows you its throat when it decides trust is an alternative to violence, then vanished. The inspector exhaled so softly the sound might have belonged to the river. He took the pen from his pocket and threw it in after the ledger. "I will buy a new one," he said, a joke committed without needing to be understood. "For the next chapter." The ferryman nodded approval. "Good," he said. "Ink sinks faster than you think," Thunder made a far remark. "The tunnels listen the way old men listen to a story they suspect they are in." I felt unmoored, and then, in the next breath, more moored than I had been since the day the shop became my job and my parent. The ledger was gone. The ledger was everywhere. The city adjusted the straps on her dress. "Witnesses," Lucien said, and touched my elbow, turning me so I could see the shapes in the archway. 2 kids with phones they had tried not to lift and failed. A woman with a basket, who was pretending to wait for a person who did not exist, an old man walking his invisible dog. It had all been arranged without me, or maybe it had arranged itself because the city knows story like a musician knows variations. "Make the absence famous," the inspector said, repeating the girl's sentence as if wearing someone else's jacket and finding it fit. We stood there longer than ceremony requires. When we turned, the cloth on the hooks seemed to have tied itself into a new knot all on its own. Auntie would have said the room was closing the door behind us politely. We left. Back at the quay, the sky had solved dusk and moved to night without consulting us. Auntie met us with towels, as if we were children who had refused to come in from the rain until our name had been called the full number of syllables. She kissed the ferryman on the cheek quick, not owed. She looked at me a long time. "You gave up your inheritance," she said. "I kept the shop," I said, then heard my voice and realized how little that sentence solved. "I kept the part that doesn't drown easily. The part that drowns was never yours," she said, which is how women in this city tell you they are proud of you, without adding to your list of reasons to weep. "Now your paper," the inspector said. "It will still hit the street in the morning. We will let it. We will arrest it. We will laud it. We will all pretend we were on the same side because that prevents people from choosing sides that would end in more funerals for boys I have not learned how to name properly." "Arrest me instead," I said, surprising everyone, including myself. The room moved around the sentence to make space. "Arrest me for drowning evidence. Make it public. If women see me in handcuffs for this, they will learn where the ledger lived." The inspector stared. Then he laughed once, so pleased that it frightened me. "You have learned the arithmetic of after," he said. "Very well. Tomorrow morning, at your shop, I will take you politely. You will smile in a way that tells girls how not to faint. You will be released before lunch. By dinner, 3 new ledgers will have been imagined, and 2 will have burned themselves in embarrassment." Lucien's jaw clicked. "You don't touch her," he said. "She asked," the inspector said. "I know what she asked," Lucien said, and his mouth twisted as if he had tasted metal. "I am the person who brings consequences to people I care about when they insist on agency." The inspector looked almost kind. "You will come to the station and stand outside," he said. "You will practice not storming rooms. You will fail at least twice." Auntie snorted. "Men," she said, with all the vowels at once. "Come," she added to me quietly. "You need to sleep with your eyes open. That requires a pillow." The shop felt different, as if its walls had been informed of a childhood friend's death and were thinking about writing a letter to his mother. I turned the sign to closed and left the lights on over the poetry section because my father used to say poems keep burglars from feeling welcome. The rain ticked the awning with the precision of a metronome in a patient surgeon's theater. In the office, I found the velvet ring box where it always is. I put the ring inside. I closed the lid. It made a sound like a soft door. I slid the box onto the top shelf behind the atlases no one buys anymore because their countries have been renamed beyond recognition. I did not tell myself I would never open it again. I have learned that never is just a word you say to domesticate later. Lucien stood in the doorway of the office and looked at me with the composed sorrow of a man who knows he is about to ask for a thing he has no right to. "There is a couch," I said, nodding toward the break room that doubles as a place for naps for people who think they are only resting their eyes. "You can have it. I wouldn't sleep well if I locked you out." And a text. "I don't sleep well when I am let in," he said, and the honesty of it made a delicate ache set up camp in the parts of me that still try to be pretty for men who deserve less. I walked past him, close enough for our shoulders to consider each other. "Kiss me," I said again, the way a person repeats a successful magic trick to test whether it is still magic. He did. It was different and exactly the same. His mouth had learned a new math since the last time, a math that included drowning and absence and a ring's new job description. We broke only when the night told us we had stolen enough. "Tomorrow?" I said. "Tomorrow," he said. "After," I added, because the arithmetic deserves its theorem. "After," he agreed. He slept. I did not. I lay on the couch in the break room and watched the ceiling practice its cracks. I thought about the girl in the inspector's house and the way she had said times, "He was kind times," as if kindness had been the knife and the boat and the rain all at once. I thought about Koa. I thought about my father writing a name he did not intend and the river swallowing a ledger the way a mother swallows an insult so her child will not learn his own name in a burnt mouth. I thought of Lucien not sleeping in the chair by the poetry section and how some men make absence into a shape you can wrap yourself around without catching a chill. At dawn, the rain revised itself into drizzle, which is what weather does when it wants to see who will keep their plans now that thunder has stopped cheering them on. I put on a cotton dress that had survived my 20s because it forgave me everything. I tied my hair. I opened the shop. He came at 8 with one car and no siren. He wore the pale suit again because men like him like to repeat costumes for events they wish to claim as traditions. 2 officers stood by the door and did their best to look bored so as not to alarm anyone who wandered in looking for a paperback to keep from going back to bed. "Elena," he said, and because yesterday had been yesterday and today was today, the name from his mouth did not scrape. "You are under arrest for destruction of potential evidence." "Potential?" I said, and it was ridiculous to be laughing, but it was morning and my hands were clean, and sometimes laughter is simply the body refusing to stand still while someone else takes the picture. He smiled with his sad happiness. It is how the law apologizes to itself for being late. And B is Mark. He cuffed me with plastic ties because he is more modern than my father's ghosts. The newspapers snapped our picture because Uncle Tung had sent a boy who sent another boy, and at least one of them sent a cousin. Auntie watched from across the street, holding a bag of mangoes she fully intended to use as weapons. The ferryman leaned against a pillar and whistled, tuneless and polite. Lucien stood 20 meters away with his hands in his pockets, like a man who had put rocks there to keep from using them. "You don't have to look brave," the inspector murmured, low enough for only me to hear as he led me to the car. "You only have to look exact." "I'm tired," I said. "The exactness of fatigue is very photogenic," he said. In the car, I saw my reflection in the window and did not hate the woman I saw. The city in the glass looked like she was proud of herself for not flooding more dramatically. At the station, they took my statement with a pen that did not feel like a betrayal because it was blue and therefore friendly. I told the truth, which is a strategy that confuses rooms built for lies. I said I had drowned a ledger because ledgers learn to think they are gods. I said I had kept pages because people who do not care about proof should not be in charge of it. I said the city permitted all of this and will again. The man with the form looked at me like a person might look at a dog who has learned to read. The inspector signed something. He unlocked something. He smiled a smile that was not for me. "Thank you for your cooperation." He said for the microphones that had been allowed to come as far as the carpet line and no farther. We will no longer be pursuing the matter. What about Uncle Tung? I asked. He loves being arrested, he said. I can't take that from him. What about the girl? I asked. He did not answer, which is how men tell the truth when they can't afford it. When I stepped back onto the street, the morning was bright enough to make forgetting feel plausible. Lucien was there, hands still in his pockets. He had a bruise on his jaw that had not belonged to him yesterday. He looked at me like a decision he could live with. You did it, he said. No, I said. We did the part the city let us do. He nodded as if to say, exactly. Then he reached into his jacket and took out the piece of paper he had tucked under Auntie's salt jar. He unfolded it and handed it to me. He had written a name there, not his yet, the name he wanted to be. It was nothing like Lucien. It was nothing like the name the inspector had used. It was an ordinary man's name, the sort of name you can say out loud in a market, and 4 men turn, all of them offering to help you carry a watermelon, because they have learned that helping is a way to remain in a story without becoming its problem. You want me to use it? I asked. When you decide I have earned it, he said. Until then, keep my letter. I slid the paper into my pocket without reading it again. Come to the shop, I said. Help me put the poetry back in the front where it refuses to sell. Help me count change. Help me pretend I have a normal day ahead in which no river is waiting for me, with the patience of a God that has learned not to interrupt. Nas file day. He looked at the door. He looked at the shelves. He looked at me. He shook his head slightly. I can't, he said. I owe a ferry I haven't paid. I owe a girl a seat on a train. I owe a man a conversation about what lists look like when they are translated into the body. Will you come back? I asked, and felt the question embarrass itself and did not rescue it. Yes, he said, and he made the lie look so like a promise that I decided to let it be both. He kissed me once, quickly this time, in public, not to defy anyone, but to announce to my own mouth that it still belonged to me. Then he walked the way men like him walk when they have decided not to be ghosts today, steadily, with the shoulders of a man who has accepted the weight of a bag you cannot see. Auntie crossed the street and pressed the bag of mangoes into my hands. For courage, she said, and for sweetness after, she added, because she knows the arithmetic and refuses to teach it as if it were beyond anyone. The ferryman tipped his cap, a gesture that cannot possibly have been taught to him by anyone alive. The inspector disappeared, because that is what men like him do when their work is best done without eyes on it and still prefers to be seen later. The city adjusted her dress. The river rehearsed her line for the evening show. Inside the shop, I put the mangoes in a bowl and set it on the counter next to the cracked mug of pencils. I opened the register. I wrote the date on a piece of scrap paper the way my father used to. I touched the walnut underside of the counter where the knot is carved and felt for the first time that the pattern might be solved rather than only admired. A girl came in with wet hair and an umbrella the size of a refusal and asked me for a book that has made girls brave for 100 years, and boys revise their claims to bravery the first time they read it alone. I sold it to her for less than I should have. I gave her a mango. She laughed as if I had told her she was allowed to keep both hands. Later, when the first edition of Noir hit the street and the headline tried to make sense of a ledger that had been drowned and a woman who had been arrested for telling the river what to remember, Auntie and I stood under the awning and shared a cigarette, Neither of us wanted to finish alone. Men read the paper and became experts on flood control and ethics for a full hour. Women read the paper and texted other women the only 3 words that matter when the city pretends to be polite. Asterisk. Are you safe? Asterisk. In the evening, the inspector came by without his suit jacket and bought a book of recipes. He paid in cash and exact change. For the girl, he said. He did not say which one. We did not ask. Near closing, a small envelope slid under the door. No stamp. My name on the front, written in a dark hand that had learned its letters from shadows. I knew how to be afraid now. Without being rude to the fear, I picked it up. I held it. I turned it in my hand. I put it under the counter next to the ring box and the mug and the ledger of my very small business. I did not open it. Not then. At midnight, the ferryman brewed jujube tea behind the terminal and pretended not to know me. I pretended not to know him. I pretended not to know whether the man who traded names like knives would come sit on the crate and ask me if I had learned how to say my own out loud without apologizing. A train cried out on the other side of the river, the way trains do when they have been asked to deliver news. The city counted her money and her mistakes. The rain made small mathematics on the slate of the quay. The river does not forget. She only pretends to be polite. I stood in the doorway of my shop, the way I had on the day the story began, the way I will on days when stories refuse to begin and still need to be lived. The sign above me flaked its gold, letter by letter, the way truth advertises its age. I locked the door. I turned and looked at the street the way a person looks at a map. Once she has decided the legend is lying to her, but the roads will still lead somewhere. My phone buzzed with a message that was just an address. No punctuation. A name that was not Lucien's underneath, the ordinary man's name, like a river trying out a new bank. I smiled in spite of myself. I smiled with myself. I went upstairs. I took the envelope from my pocket. I held it up to the light. I did not open it. Not yet. I set it next to the ring box and said both their names out loud until my mouth understood they were not the same word. The city listened, polite as always, and somewhere beneath her, in an old chamber that smells of cedar and honesty, a ledger continued to become river, and the river continued to become us, and we, in all our arithmetic and afters, continued to decide which doors are doors, and which are promises we can afford to keep.